How's it going, y'all? I'm Noah Giddens, and this is the start of a new series, Wikireads. This series is going to essentially just be me reading Wikipedia articles. Nothing too fancy. Figured it's a good way to encourage me to do a little bit more research, even if it's just reading a Wikipedia article. And also a good way for anyone who's interested in a topic to have someone to listen to, learn a little bit more in the background. I like to ramble about stuff, so I figured this was a good way to, well, get a bit more of that in. Let's start with the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, and politics centered in Harlem, Massachusetts, New York City. Spanning the 1920s and the 1930s, at the time it was known as the New Negro Movement, named after the New Negro, a 1925 anthology edited by Alan Locke. This movement also included the new African American cultural expressions across the urban areas of the Northeast and Midwest United States, affected by a renewed militants in the general struggles for civil rights. Combined with the Great Migration of African American workers fleeing the racist conditions of the Jim Crow Deep South, as Harlem was the final destination of the largest number of those who migrated north. Though it was centered in the Harlem neighborhood, many francophone black writers from African and Caribbean colonies who lived in Paris were also influenced by the movement, which expanded from about the 1918s to the mid 1930s. Many of its ideas lived on much longer. The zenith of this flowering of Negro literature, as James Weldon Johnson preferred to call the Harlem Renaissance, took place between 1924, when Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, hosted a party for black writers where many white publishers were an audience. And in 1929, the year of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, the Harlem Renaissance was considered to have been a rebirth of the African American arts. Many people would argue that the Harlem Renaissance never ended and has continued to be an important cultural force in the United States through the decades. From the age of stride piano jazz and blues to the age of bebop, hip hop, rock and roll, disco, and well, I just accidentally read a bit ahead, so yeah, those. Let's move on to the background. Until the end of the Civil War, the majority of African Americans had been enslaved and lived in the South. During the Reconstruction era, the emancipated African Americans, freedmen, began to strive for civic participation, political equality, and economic and cultural self-determination. Soon after the end of the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 gave rise to speeches by African American congressmen addressing this bill. By 1875, 16 African Americans had been elected and served in Congress, and gave numerous speeches with the newfound civil empowerment. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 was denounced by black congressmen and resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The part of the Reconstruction legislation by Republicans. During the mid to late 1870s, his racist rights organized in the Democratic Party launched a murderous campaign of racist terrorism to regain political power throughout the South. From 1890 to 1908, they proceeded to pass legislation that disenfranchised most African Americans and poor whites, trapping them without representation. They established white supremacist regimes of Jim Crow segregation in the South and one-party bloc votings behind Southern Democrats. The Democratic Party politicians many having been former slave owners and political and military leaders of the Confederacy, conspired to deny African Americans the exercise of civil and political rights by terrorizing black communities with lynch mobs and other forms of vigilante violence, as well as by insinuating a convict labor system that forced many thousands of African Americans back into unpaid labor in mines, on plantations, and on public work projects such as roads and levees. Convicted laborers were often subject to brutal forms of corporal punishment, overworked, and disease from unsanitary conditions. Death rates were extraordinarily high, while a small number of African Americans were able to acquire land shortly after the Civil War. Most were exploited as sharecroppers. Whether sharecropping or on their own acreage, most of the black population was closely financially dependent on agriculture. This added to another impetus, I'm not sure what that word is, sorry about that. This added to another need for the migration. The arrival of the boll weevil, the beetle eventually came to waste 8% of the country's cotton yield annually, and thus disproportionately impacted this part of American citizenry. As life in the South became increasingly difficult, African Americans began to migrate north in great numbers. Most of the future leading lights of what would become known as the Harlem Renaissance movement arose from a generation that had memories of the gains and losses of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Sometimes their parents, grandparents, or themselves had been slaves. Their ancestors had sometimes benefited by parental investment in cultural capital, including better than average education. Many in the Harlem Renaissance were part of the early 20th century Great Migration out of the South into the African American neighborhoods of the Northeast and Midwest. African Americans sought a better standard of living and relief from the institutionalized racism in the South. Others were people of African descent from racially stratified communities in the Caribbean who came to the United States hoping for a better life, unifying most of them in their convergence in Harlem. I am sorry for that amount of stuttering. I am not good at reading something cold. I am going to continue though because, like I said, I'm doing this series mostly so I can ramble a bit more, and so I can learn more. I have to write a paper on this. This is a good general overview while I do more research on my own. Now let's talk about the development. During the early portion of the 20th century, Harlem was the destination for migrants from around the country, attracting both people from the South seeking work and an educated class who made the area of a center of culture, as well as a growing Negro middle class. These people were looking for a fresh start, and this was a good place to go. The district had originally been developed in the 19th century as an exclusive suburb for white middle class and upper middle class and the upper middle classes. Its affluent beginnings led to the development of stately houses, grand avenues, and world-class amenities such as the Polo Grounds and the Harlem Opera House. During the enormous influx of European immigrants in the late 19th century, the once exclusive district was abandoned by the white middle class who moved further north. Now, this is not what it says on the Wikipedia page, but if I had to take a guess as to why they moved further north, although there was an influx of white European immigrants, during this time, racial tensions, mostly focused on African American communities as they were the most discriminated against. Oftentimes, white folk would still discriminate against other white folk based on their heritage, such as the Irish when they came over. I don't believe the Germans had too much of an issue. The British, well, they colonized it. But if I had to take a guess, the reason why this influx of immigrants drove them north wasn't the fact that they were immigrants, but more of the fact that they were Irish immigrants. They were Eastern European immigrants. They weren't my heritage, so they are now bad. That's if just I want to analyze that a little bit. Continuing on, Harlem became an African American neighborhood in the early 1900s, and in 1910, a large block along 100, 135th Street and the Fifth Avenue was bought by various African American realtors and a church group. Many more African Americans arrived during the First World War. During the war, the immigration of laborers from Europe virtually ceased. While the war effort resulted in a massive demand for unskilled labor in the industrial industry, the Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans to cities such as Chicago. Why am I stuttering here? It's Chicago. The many African Americans went to cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and New York. Despite the increase in popularity of Negro culture, virulent white racism, often more recent ethnic immigrants, continue to affect African American communities, even in the North. After the end of World War I, many African American soldiers who fought in segregated units such as the Harlem Hellfighters came home to a nation whose citizens often did not respect their accomplishments. Race riots and other civil uprisings occurred throughout the United States during the Red Summer of 1919, reflecting economic competition over jobs and housing in many cities, as well as tensions over social territories. Mainstream recognition of Harlem culture. The first stage of the Harlem Renaissance started in the 1910s, and in 1917, the premiere of Granny Maumee, the writer's dream, Simon of Syrian plays for a Negro theater took place. These plays, written by white playwright Ridgely Torrance, featured African American actors conveying complex human emotions and yearnings. They rejected the stereotypes of blackface and minstrel shows traditions. James Weldon Johnson in 1917 called the premieres of these plays the most important single event in the entire history of the Negro in American theater. Just to put this a bit more in perspective, again, I'm sure you all can already have an idea of this. Oftentimes before this, from what I can tell, if someone was African American and appeared in a show, if they even got the chance to get a character in the show, it was often then portrayed by a white actor donning blackface and then making a mockery out of them, acting as if because they're a minority, they aren't human, treating them as if they're less. So that's why the fact that these plays, even though they were written by a white playwright, the fact that they showed complex human emotions and yearnings broke free from that stereotype of these uneducated, dumb minorities, and now actually is showing, no, these are people who experience the same things you and I do, even though they might experience more racial tensions and discrimination. Another landmark came in 1919 when the communist poet Claude McKay published his militant sonnet "If We Must Die," which introduced a dramatically a political dimension to the themes of African culture, her inheritance, and the modern urban experience featured in his 1917 poem, Invocation, and Harlem Dancer. Published under the pseudonym Eli Edwards, these were his first appearance in print in the United States after immigrating from Jamaica. Although If You Must Die never alluded to race, his African American readers heard its notes of defiance in the face of racism and the nationwide race riots and lynchings that are then taking place. By the end of the First World War, the fiction of James Weldon Johnson and the poetry of Claude McKay were describing the reality of contemporary African American life in America. The Harlem Renaissance grew out of the changes that had been taking place in the African American communities since the abolition of slavery. As the expansion of the communities in the North, these accelerated the consequences of World War I and the great social and cultural changes in the early 20th century United States. Industrialization was attracting people to cities from rural areas and gave new rise to a mass culture. Contributing factors leading to the Harlem Renaissance were the great migration of African Americans to northern cities, which concentrated ambitious people in a place where they could encourage each other, and the First World War has created a new industrial work opportunities for tens of thousands of people. Well, factors leading to the decline of this era would include the Great Depression. Woo, that was a long one. But also an important one. And that section, it just showed how, although this group of people have been treated less than dirt, we're now finally able to find other creatives, find other people who could encourage them and actually show, hey, we may all come from different places, but we have a shared background. We have a shared experience of discrimination and racism against us. And now we're in a place where we can show this side of reality to the white people who are blind to it. Let's move on to some literature, though. In 1917, Hubert Harrison, the father of Harlem radicalism, founded the Liberty League and The Voice, the first first newspaper, respectively, of the New Negro movement. Harrison's organizations and newspapers were political, but also emphasized the arts. His newspaper had poetry for the people and book review sections. In 1927, in the Pittsburgh Courier, Harrison challenged the notion of the Renaissance. He argued that the Negro literacy Renaissance notion overlooked the stream of literacy and artistic products which has flowed uninterruptedly from Negro writers from the 1850s to present, and said that the so-called Renaissance was largely a white invention. Alternatively, a writer like the Chicago-based Fenton Johnson, who had began publishing in the early 1900s, called it a forerunner of the Renaissance, one of the first Negro revolutionary poets. Again, since I started a lot, I do want to quickly summarize that. Effectively, although Hubert Harrison was a major person in the Renaissance, and he did coin it sounds like he did coin the term of the Renaissance, or at least gave credence to it. The Pittsburgh Courier criticized him as, even though he's saying this is a new rebirth of creativity in the black communities, African American communities, claiming this is a rebirth takes away from African American writers from before this time. This isn't from what I can tell, the Pittsburgh Courier wasn't arguing this isn't a renaissance. Well, they were arguing this isn't a renaissance, but a continuation of black creativity, which I find interesting. Just how they both see this as being a time of creativity, but one sees it as a new blossoming of it, and the other sees it as a continuation that's white people are calling new. Nevertheless, with the Harlem Renaissance came a sense of acceptance for African American writers, such as Langston Hughes put it. When Harlem came when Harlem came the courage to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear and shame. Alan Locke's anthology, The New Negro, was considered the cornerstone of this cultural revolution. The anthology featured several African American writers and poets, from the well-known such as Noah Neal Hurtstone and communist Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, to lesser known like the poet Annie Spencer. Many poets of the Harlem Renaissance were inspired her to tie the threads of African American culture into their poems, as a result, jazz poetry was heavily developed during this time. The Weary Blues was a notable jazz poem written by Langston Hughes. Though their works of literature, through their works of literature, black authors were able to give a voice to the African American identity, as well as strive for a community of support and acceptance. Religion. Christianity played a major role in the Harlem Renaissance. Many of the writers and social critics discussed the role of Christianity in African American lives. For example, the famous poem by Langston Hughes, Madam and the Mister, reflects on the temperature and moods towards religion in the Harlem Renaissance. The story covers the Crisis magazine's publication in May 1936, which explains how important Christianity was regarding the proposed union of the three largest Methodist churches of 1936. This article shows the controversial question of unification for these churches. The article, The Catholic Church and the Negro Priest, published in The Crisis, January 1920, demonstrates the obstacles African American priests faced in the Catholic Church. These articles confront what was said about as policies based in race excluded African Americans from high positions in the church. This wasn't without discourse, however. Various forms of religious worship existed during this time of African American intellectual reawakening. Although there were racist attitudes with the current Abrahamic religious areas, many African Americans contributed to push towards the practice of a more inclusive doctrine. For example, George Joseph McWilliams presents various experiences during his pursuits towards priesthoods, of rejection on the basis of his color and his race, yet he shares his frustration in an attempt to incite action on the part of the Crisis magazine community. There were other forms of spiritualism practiced among African Americans during the Harlem Renaissance. Some of these religions and philosophies were inherited from African ancestry. For example, the religion of Islam was present in Africa as early as the 8th century through the trans-Saharan trade. Islam came to Harlem likely through the migration of members of the Moorish Science Temple of America, which was established in 1913 in New Jersey. Various forms of Judaism were practiced, including Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. But it was Black Hebrew Israelites that founded the religious belief system during the early 20th century in the Harlem Renaissance. Traditional forms of religion acquired from various aspects of Africa were inherited in practices during this area. Some common examples were voodoo and Santerin? Santira. I want to say Santira. I don't know. I'm probably butchering that. There were critiques, however. Religious critiques during this era was found in music, literature, art, theater, and poetry. The Harlem Renaissance encouraged analytic dialogue that include open critique and the adjustment of current religious ideas. One of the major contributors to the discussion of African American Renaissance culture was Aaron Douglas, who, with his artwork, reflected the revisions African Americans were making to the Christian dogma. Douglas used biblical imageries as inspiration to various pieces of artwork, but with the rebellious twist of an African influence. Corty Curlin's poem Heritage expressed the inner struggle of an African American between his past African heritage and the new Christian culture. More severe criticisms of Christian religion can be found in Langston Hughes' poem Merry Christmas, where he exposes the irony of religion as a symbol for good, yet force for oppression and injustice. So, to me, it seems like religion played a major role in the Harlem Renaissance, but less as religion sparked the Renaissance, and instead the Renaissance influenced the religion. While the African Americans, who majority were Christians, went to the north, they retained some of their historical and cultural roots from Africa, and as such expressed it in the Christian faith. While doing this, they were often rejected from priesthood by established religions solely because of their color, and the religion of others were often used as justification for discrimination. This didn't stop them, however. As Christianity grew, they also continued to embrace more traditional African religions, such as Islam, which, as stated, was found in Africa as early as the 8th century. And then Judaism as well, which I find just interesting because, honestly, I did not expect that. I just don't know why. I never thought about it, but that's really interesting to learn. Now let's move on to the music of this era. The new way of playing piano was called Harlem Stride style, which was created during the Harlem Renaissance, and helped blur the lines between the poor African Americans and the social elite African Americans. The traditional jazz band was comprised primarily of brass instruments and was constructed as a symbol of the South, but the piano was considered an instrument of the wealthy. This instrumental modification to an existing genre, the wealthy African Americans now had more access to jazz music, as its popularity soon spread through the country and consequently at an all-time high. Innovation and liveliness were important characteristics of performers at the beginnings of jazz. Jazz performers and composers at the time, such as E.B. Blake, Noble Stilley, Jolly Roll Morton, Lucky Roberts, James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, Andy. I'm not going to keep reading all their names. I will mention band leaders Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Fletcher Harrison. However, just so you know, the reason why I skipped over those names is because I don't want to butcher everyone's names. The names are on here. There's Andy. There's Fats. I would prefer to try to respect these artists' names as much as I can, especially since we aren't doing a deep dive into them or really bringing up too much besides the fact that the music was influential. Either way, these were extremely talented, skillful, and competent, and inspirational. They're still considered to they were still considered having led great parts of the foundation for future musicians of their genre. Duke Ellington gained popularity during the Harlem Renaissance. According to Charles Garrett, the resulting portrait of Ellington reveals him to not only be the gifted composer, bandleader, and musician we have come to know, but also an earthly person with basic desires, weakness, and eccentricities. Ellington did not let his popularity get to him. He remained calm and focused during his music, and focused on his music. During this period, the musical styles of blacks was becoming more and more attractive to whites. White novelists, dramatists, and composers started to exploit the musical tendencies and themes of African Americans in their works. Composers, including William Grant Stills, William L. Dawson, and Florence Price, used poems written by African American poets in their songs, and would implement the rhythms, harmonies, and melodies of African American music, such as blues, spirituals, and jazz, into their concert pieces. His African Americans. One second, I'm just muting this. African Americans began to emerge with whites into classical worlds of musical composition. The first African American male to gain widespread recognition was a concert artist in both his region and internationally, was Roland Hayes. He trained with Arthur Calhoun in Chattanooga. I hope I pronounced that right. I probably butchered it. And at Fisk University in Nashville. Later, he studied with Arthur Hubbard in Boston and with George Hensel and Amanda Aldridge in London, England. He began singing in public as a student, and toured with the Fisk Jubilee Singers in 1911. According to James Vernon Hatch and Leo Haliman, All Black Review run Little Chillin' and was considered the most successful musical genre of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so what I was saying about jazz influencing future generations, I can see that a bit. I haven't studied music history. I like to sing and such. I've looked a little bit here and there, but from what I know, jazz is a bit more sporadic. It's kind of a go with the flow type of music where you can have written jazz pieces, but you don't have to have a written jazz piece to produce jazz live on stage. It's all about just making what's fun, making what's spiritual, what emotions you want to evoke. And although quite radically different, I can see its influences in like electronic music, as oftentimes they will again do that bit more random, more just go with the flow and trying to inspire a music. And I'm not just talking about dubstep that goes hard, but I'm also talking about more dedicated and calmer electric music as well, such as the one written by Fluorescent Funeral. I brought him up before, but would be a good example of where I can see this influence, even without knowing it could have gone. Fashion. This will be a fun one. Fashion during the Harlem Renaissance, the black clothing scene took a dramatic turn from the prim and proper. Many young women preferred from short skirts and silk stockings to waist-dropped dresses and cloth hats. Women wore loosely fitted garments and accessorized with long strands of pearl bead necklaces, feathered boas, cigarette holders. The fashion of the Harlem Renaissance was used to convey elegance and flamboyance. the need to be created with the vibrant colors of style of and the vibrant dance styles of the 1920s in mind. Popular by the 1930s was trendy, elegant trimmed beret. Men wore loose suits that tied to the latter style known as zoot, which consisted of wide legs, high-waisted, peg-topped trousers, and a long coat with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Men also wore vibrant hats, colored socks, hence white-colored gloves, and velvet collared Chesterfield coats. During this time, African Americans expressed respect for their heritage through the fad leopard skin coats, including the powerful African animal. Powerful African animal. The extraordinarily successful dancer Josephine Baker, through performing in Paris during the height of the Renaissance, was a major fashion trendsetter for black and white women alike. Her gowns from the courier Jean Patou, I hope I pronounced that right, were much copied, especially her stage costumes, which Vogue magazine called startling. Josephine Baker was also credited for highlighting the Art Deco fashion after the era she performed her dense salvage. That looks like it would be pronounced savage. I don't think it's savage though. But moving on. During the Paris performance, she adorned a skirt made of string and artificial bananas. And Ethel Moores, another popular black performer, starred in silent films in the 1920s and 30s, and was recognizable by a signature bob hairstyle. Just let me see. Alright. Because I am on a time limit. I really should have dedicated more time to reading this, but I am on a time limit. Luckily, we are getting close to the end. With that said, let's talk about the characteristics and themes of the Harlem Renaissance. Characterizing the Harlem Renaissance was an overtly racial pride that came to be represented in the idea of the new Negro, who, through intellect and production of literature, art, and the music, could challenge the pervading racism and stereotypes to promote progressive and social politics, and racial and social integration. The creation of art and literature would serve to uplift the race. There would be no uniting forms, singularly characterizing the art that emerged from the Harlem Renaissance. Rather, it included a wide variety of cultural elements and styles, including a pan-African perspective, high culture and low culture or low life, from the traditional forms of music and jazz, traditional and new experimental forms of literature such as modernism, and the new form of jazz poetry. This duality meant that numerous African American artists came into conflict with conservatives in the black intelligentsia, who took issue with the depiction of black life. Some common themes represented during the Harlem Renaissance were the influence of the experience of slavery and emerging African American folk traditions on black identity, the effects of institutional racism, the dilemmas inherent in performing and writing for elite white audiences, and the question of how to convey the experience of modern black life in the urban North. The Harlem Renaissance was one of primarily African American involvement. It rested on a support system of black patrons, black-owned businesses, and publications. However, it also depended on the patronage of white Americans such as Carl Van Vexen and Charlotte Osgood Mason, who provided various forms of assistance, opening doors which otherwise might have remained closed to the publication of work outside of the Black American community. This support often took the form of patronage or publication. Carl Van Vixen was one of more noteworthy more noteworthy white Americans involved in the Harlem Renaissance. He allowed for assistance to the black American communities. Because he wanted racial sameness. There's other whites interested in the so-called primitive cultures. While many whites viewed black American cultures at the time, and wanted to see such primitivism in the work coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. As with most fads, some people may have exploited in the rush of publicity. Interest in African American lives also generated experimental but lasting collaborative work, such as an all-black publication of George Gershwin opera Porgy and Bess, and Virgil Thompson and Gertrude Stein's in Four Saints in Three Acts. Both productions, in both productions, the choral constructor Eva Jesse, he was part of the creative team. Her choir was featured in Four Saints. The music world also found white band leaders defying racist attitudes to include the best and brightest African American stars of music and songs in their productions. The African Americans used art to prove their humanity and demand for equality. The Harlem Renaissance led to more opportunities for blacks to be published by mainstream houses. Many authors began to write novels, magazines, and newspapers during this time. Their new fiction attracted a great number of attention from the nation at large. Among authors who traditionally were known were, long list again. Jean Toomer, Jesse Fawcett, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, James Weldon Johnson, Alan Locke, Omar Al-Amir, Eric D. Waldron, and Langston Hughes. Richard Bruce Nugent? Richard Bruce, 1906 to 1987, and wrote Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, an important contribution, especially relating to the experimental form in LGBT themes during the period. The Harlem Renaissance helped lay the foundation for the post-World War II protest movement of the Civil Rights Movement. Moreover, black artists who rose to creative maturity afterwards were inspired by this literacy movement. The Renaissance was more than a literacy or artistic movement, as it possessed a certain sociological development, particularly through a new racial consciousness. Through ethnic pride, as seen as Back to Africa movement led by Jamaican Marcus Garvey, at the same time, a different expression of ethnic pride promoted by W.E.B. Du Bois, introduced the notion of the talented tenth. Du Bois wrote of the talented tenth. The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst. These talented tenths were considered the finest examples of the worth of black Americans as a response to rampant racism during the period. No particular leadership was assigned to the talented tenth, but they were to be immaculated. In both literature and popular discussion, complex ideas such as Du Bois' concept of two-ness dualism were introduced in The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. Du Bois explored the divided awareness of one's identity with the unique critique of social ramifications of racial consciousness. This explanation was later revived during the Black Pride movement in the early 1970s. And now we are on the last bit of this Wikipedia article, the influence of this entire movement. The Harlem Renaissance was successful in that it brought the black experience clearly within corpus of American cultural history, not only through an explosion of culture, but on a sociological level. The legacy of the Harlem Renaissance redefined how America and the world viewed African Americans. The migration of Southern blacks to the North changed the image of African Americans from the rural, undereducated peasants to one of urban cosmopolitan and sophistication. And this new identity led to a greater social consciousness, and African Americans became players on the world stage, expanding intellectual and social contracts internationally. The progress, both symbolic and real, during this period became a point of reference from which the African American communities gained a spirit of self-determination, which provided a growing sense of both black urbanity and black militancy, as well as the foundation for the community to build upon the civil rights struggles in the 1950s and 1960s. The urban settling of rapidly developing Harlem provided a venue for African Americans of all backgrounds to appreciate the variety of black life and culture. Through this expression, and the Harlem Renaissance encouraged the new application of folk roots in culture. For instance, folk material and spirituals provided a rich source of the artistic and intellectual imagination, which freed blacks from the establishment of past conditions. Through sharing these cultural experiences, a consciousness sprung forth in the form of a unified racial identity. However, there was some pressure within certain groups of the Harlem Renaissance to adopt sentimental segments of conservative white America in order to be taken seriously by the mainstream, results being that the queer community, while far more accepted in Harlem than most places in the country at the time, was most fully lived out in the smoky, dark lights of bars, nightclubs, and cabarets in the city. It was within these venues that the blues music scene boomed. In the sense it has not gained traction and recognition within popular culture, queer artists used it as a way to express themselves honestly. Even though there were factions within the Renaissance that were accepting of queer culture and lifestyles, one could still be arrested for engaging in homosexual acts. Many people, including author Alice Dunbar Nelson and mother of blues Gertrude Mulvaney, had husbands who were romantically linked to other women as well. Mulvaney was known to dress in traditionally male clothing, and her blues lyrics often reflected her sexual sexual interest for women, which were extremely radical at the time. Mulvaney was also the first person to introduce blues into vaudeville. Rainey's protege, Bessie Smith, was another artist who used the blues rays to express herself with such lines as, "When you see two women walking hand in hand, just look them over and try to understand. Now, they'll go to those parties, have a light down low, only those parties where women can go." I liked that. I liked how well that flowed. Another prominent blues singer is Gadley Bentley, who was known to cross-dress. Bentley was the owner of her clam house on 133rd Street in Harlem, which was a hub for queer patrons. Hamilton Lodge in Harlem hosted an annual drag ball which attracted thousands who wanted to watch as a couple hundred young men came to dance the night away in drag. Though there were safe havens in Harlem, there were prominent voices such as that of Abernathian Baptist church minister Adam Clayton, who actively campaigned against homosexuality. The Harlem Renaissance gave birth to the idea of the new Negro. The New Negro movement was an effort to define what it meant to be African American by African Americans, rather than let the degrading stereotypes and caricatures found in black space minstrel practices do so. There was also the Neo-New Negro movement, which not only challenged racial definitions and stereotypes, but also sought to challenge gender roles, normative sexuality, and sexism in America in general. In this respect, the Harlem Renaissance was far ahead of the rest of America in terms of embracing feminism and queer communities, or queer culture. These ideals received some pushback as freedom of sexuality, particularly pertaining to women, which during the time in Harlem was known as women loving women, and was seen as confirming the stereotype that black women were loose and lacked sexual, essentially sexual control, I'm assuming that means. The black bourgeoisie saw this as hampering the cause of black people in America, and giving fuel to the fire of racist sentiments towards the country. Yet for all the efforts by both sectors of white and conservative black America, queer culture and artists defined major proportions of not only the Harlem Renaissance, but also so much of our culture today. Author of Black Man's Burden, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote that the Harlem Renaissance was surely as gay as it was black. That's actually really interesting. I did not realize that the Harlem Renaissance also inspired LGBT communities to actually show that the LGBT, this is the early 1900s, and there was a movement that showed that. That is really cool. I never knew that. But to end this off, we have to read the criticisms of this movement. Many critics point out that the Harlem Renaissance could not escape its history and culture in its attempt to create a new one or sufficiently separate from the foundational elements of white European culture. Often Harlem intellectuals, while proclaiming a new racial conscience, resorted to the mercy cry of their white counterpart by adopting their clothing, sophisticated mannerisms, and etiquette. This mimicry may have also been called assimilation, as that is typically what minority members of any social construct must do in order to fit social norms created by that construct's majority. This could be seen as a reason that the artists and cultural productions in Harlem Renaissance did not overcome the presence of white American values and did not reject these values. In regards, the creation of the new Negro, as Harlem intellectuals thought, was considered a success. The Harlem Renaissance appealed to a mixed audience. The literature appealed to African American middle class and to white. Its magazines such as The Crisis, a monthly journal of the NAACP, and Opportunity was an official publication of the Urban Unity League, employed by Harlem Renaissance writers on the editorial staff, published poetry and short stories by black writers, and promoted African American culture through articles, reviews, and annual literacy prizes. As important as these literary outlets were, however, the Harlem Renaissance relied heavily on white publishing houses and white-owned magazines. A major accomplishment of the Renaissance was to open the door to mainstream white periodicals and publishing houses. Although the relationship between the Renaissance writers and white publishers and the audience created some controversies, W.E.B. Du Bois did not oppose the relation between black writers and white publishers, but he was critical of the works such as Claude McKay's best-selling novel *Home to Harlem* (1920s) for appealing to the prudent demands of white readers and publishers for portrayals of black licentiousness. I've never seen that word before. I'm assuming it means bad. I don't know exactly, but I'm assuming it's bad. Langston Hughes spoke for most of writers and artists when he wrote the essay "The Negro's Artist in Racial Mountain," 1926, that black artists intended to express themselves freely, no matter what the black public or white public thought. Hughes, in his writings, returned to the themes of racial passing, but during the Harlem Renaissance, began to explore the topic of homosexuality and homophobia. He began to use disruptive language in his writings. He explored the topic because it was a theme that during this time was not discussed. African American musicians and writers were among mixed audiences his as well, having experienced positive and negative outcomes through the New Negro movement. For musicians, Harlem, New York's cabarets and nightclubs shined a light upon black performers and allowed for black residencies to enjoy music and dancing. However, some of the most popular clubs that showcased black musicians were exclusively for white audiences. One of the most famous white-only nightclubs in Harlem was the Cotton Club, where popular black musicians such as Duke Ellington frequently performed. Ultimately, the black musicians who appeared at these white-only clubs became far more successful and became part of the mainstream music scene. Similarly, black writers were given an opportunity to shine once the light of the New Negro movement gained traction, such as short stories and novels and poetry and poems by black authors began taking form and getting into various print publications in the 1910s and 1920s. Although it seemed a good way to establish their identities and culture, many authors note how hard it was for their work to actually go anywhere. Writer Charles Chesnutt in 1877, and for example, notes that there was no indication of his race alongside his publication in the Atlantic Monthly at the publisher's request. A prominent factor in the New Negro struggle was that their work has been made out to be different and exotic to white audiences, making the necessity for black writers to appeal to them and compete with each other to get their work out. Famous black author and poet Langston Hughes explained that black authored works were placed similarly fashioned to those of Oriental or foreign origin. They were being used occasionally in comparison to their white-made counterparts. Once a spot for black work was taken, authors had to look somewhere else to publish. Certain aspects of Harlem Renaissance were accepted without debate and without scrutiny. One of these was the future of the new Negro. Artists and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance echoed American progressivism in its faith in democratic reform, in its belief in art and literature as agents of change, and in its most uncritical belief in itself and its future. This progressive worldview rendered black intellectuals, just like their white counterparts, unprepared for the rude shock of the Great Depression, and the Harlem Renaissance ended abruptly because the naive assumptions of the centrality of culture unrelated to economics and social realities. And that is the Harlem Renaissance. I know I butchered a lot, and I know I probably should have been faster, read it better, but, I think we learned a lot here today. One moment. We've learned that this Renaissance inspired black communities, black people, to show their creativity and actually become something more than the stereotypes they were made out to be. It also inspired social change as they were an early place of queer acceptance. And even though not everyone agreed with it, it did show that there was an inkling of, hey, everyone should be equal. Doesn't matter your color, your skin, your sexuality, anything. I find that real interesting. Well, people like Duke Ellington may have mostly performed in white only venues, clearly trying to show them as just a look at this foreign show. It still made an impact and gave some introduction to this culture and this identity that for a lot of white Americans at the time was seen as barbaric, primitive, and now they got to see a look into this, into the prejudices they actually held, and see they didn't hold up as well. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.